I'm really, really pleased and honored that we have Meryl Alper here today. It's a real treat, and already this week she's been meeting with a ton of people around campus. It's just been a really, really good match for our own department, but also people in other similar departments all over campus, people in disability studies. It's been really awesome. So it's been really, really nice. So Meryl received her PhD from Annenberg West in 2013?
Nope, 2015 last May.
2015. Oh my gosh, time flies.
Yeah.
We've known each other for a long time. So 2015, oh, of course, because it's been your first year. So she just finished up her first year at Northeastern University. So congratulations on surviving the first year as an assistant professor. And what's also really interesting about Meryl, a couple things. One is that Meryl, before going back to grad school, worked in children's television, both in research and in more of like the operation side of things, but worked for all the cool different, Nickelodeon, Disney, etc. And so it's really interesting that she brings this industry perspective as well. And she also has like a solid communication background, having her BA from Northwestern in communications. So she like went whole way through, she's stuck with it. So, and her topic is just incredibly interesting, and I think really important in terms of its application to societal issues and talking about difference and equity in ways that maybe we don't frequently frame it. And so something I've really loved about Meryl's work for years is that she really challenges us to be thinking about terms and concepts that we use frequently in communication, like voice, which we'll talk about today, and mobility, and has really already, in her young career, really added to the conversation. Like Meryl's work on mobility within mobile communication, which you might think is just about iPads and phones, but the work, the insight and thoughtfulness that she brought to that particular sub-area has been a huge asset. So it's just really nice. I think that it's been something that everybody could benefit from. So it's just really an honor. I'm so glad you're here. And I'm so glad so many people got to talk with you. And I think that everybody shares my excitement about hearing about your talk. So let's welcome Dr. Meryl Alper.
Thank you. Sort of two notes. One, it's somewhat of not a bit of a fraud, but I started at Northwestern at Medill in the journalism school and then switched to comm. So it sort of was a little bit of a false start, you might be able to say. And it's also really nice to be back here at UW because the sort of seed of what I'm presenting on today, I actually presented a little bit of at the mobile pre-conference back in 2014 that was on campus here when ICA was in Seattle. So it's really great to be able to, not to say full circle because it's still itself a work in progress, so kind of rounding the bend of the circle to come back here to be able to chat with you all. So thanks for having me, and thank you also to Katie for organizing. So as Katie mentioned, I am currently an assistant professor of communication studies at Northeastern University and a faculty associate at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And in my work, as Katie sort of alluded to, I study the social and cultural implications of communication technologies, but particularly thinking about young people with disabilities. And why is this population particularly meaningful, both in terms of practice and in terms of the field of communication? There's a lot of reasons, but one thing that's particularly striking to me is that, so according to the National Center for Education Statistics, of young people ages 3 to 21 in the public education system, 6.4 million young people receive special education services. That is 13% of all US public school students. And yet, in the area of research on young people and technology, there is little to no research on this population. And I say this population, and I mean that in a in a broad way. So young people with disabilities differ greatly within and across disability labels. There's a whole reason why autism is called a spectrum. There's also incredible differences by race, gender, ethnicity, class, and so forth. So I say the term population here, and I really want to qualify that. But I did set forth a preliminary agenda for approaching questions related to young people and disability in my first monograph, Digital Youth with Disabilities, that was published by MIT Press in 2014. You don't have to physically buy the book. It is also available as a free PDF on the MIT Press and I think MacArthur website. So there is that. So my talk today is building on that prior work by asking not just how disability fits into communication research, but really thinking about how disability can be incorporated into the very fundamental theoretical framings that we use in communication to understand society and cultural life. With notable exception from scholars such as Gerard Goggin, Jonathan Stern, Elizabeth Elsesser, Beth Haller, who've been doing some really interesting work across media, communication, and disability, there's been relatively little reflection in our field on how the social, cultural, and technical practices of disability can add to our core ideas of communication. So in my presentation today, I'm going to focus on sort of one area of this. How the study of mobile media and mediated interpersonal communication can better reflect the use of technologies like this one, a portable speech output communication device, which is used by individuals with speech disorders as a mode of expression. With this particular device, which is called the Springboard Lite, and it's produced by assistive technology company PRC, one would press a button on, this is a touch screen, so one would press the button, some of it has text, some of them have just icons, some are icons and text, would essentially press the buttons to create a sentence in the sort of white space, and then for the mobile device to output speech, you would press the white space and to construct the sentence. And this one, the sentence that is formed here, ready to be spoken, or perhaps already spoken here, is "I have something to tell you," which I thought was a pretty fitting way to have a prologue for this talk, because that is something that I certainly have. So to frame the research that I've been working on, so over 16 months from 2012 to 2014, I studied how 20 young people, ages 3 to 13 in the greater Los Angeles area, each with significant speech impairments due to various developmental disabilities, including autism and cerebral palsy, use speech-generating devices for communication. And these devices have increasingly taken the form from those larger, more expensive, and software-rich technologies, have increasingly taken the form of iPads and mobile apps. And the iPad, which made its debut in 2010 when I started my PhD at Annenberg and knew as somebody who was studying kids and technology, this is a device that's going to have some meaning to people and figuring out, and not just one meaning, but many meanings. And so I've been tracing sort of one way of looking at meaning and how it's constructed around these technologies. And it's difficult to say, in this case at least, how many young people are specifically using the iPad in this way as a communication device, but at least in one school district that I spoke with, and I should say, this was a school district of approximately 650,000 students, so you can guess which school district in the greater Los Angeles area that was, but that at least 150 students just in that school district were using the iPad as a speech-generating device. So, multiply kind of onward from that, potentially. So my research centered on the question of how their parents, siblings, and extended families, and the children themselves made sense of the new routines that these technologies introduced into their lives, the meanings that they ascribed to these devices, and as well to the culture around them, the culture of Apple, the culture of disability, the culture of childhood. What are the meanings that they use to make sense of these new technologies that were also very much tied to older traditions, older devices, older infrastructures that they were also a part of as well? So I observed families being trained by speech-language pathologists on how to use these technologies with their children. I interviewed parents. I interviewed different school district and administrators across multiple school districts, across a couple different counties in the LA area. I attended parent workshops on how to understand these technologies. I sat in on groups for kids who were speaking with these kinds of technologies, groups for them to hang out with one another and speak to one another through using them. I also went to different assistive technology fairs, local ones and sort of bigger, more corporate ones, to kind of get a sense of the landscape. And so this work has found its way to a couple different spaces. So one is my forthcoming book, again through MIT Press, which will come out early next year, called Giving Voice, Mobile Communication, Disability, and Inequality. And the second is a book chapter for the Routledge Companion to Disability and Media that's still actually a work in progress. And my talk today is particularly drawing on that book chapter. And I'm really interested in your thoughts, and it's still kind of open-ended, so kind of connections both to your work or ideas that you have, input. Really, it's kind of at this perfect stage where I'd love to hear from you and your thoughts as well. So with that, to set the scene, literally and figuratively, the fear that mobile media impair face-to-face communication is nearly timeless, dating back at least to Socrates. Long before their capacity for internet connectivity, newspapers, music players, and even kaleidoscopes were once blamed for dulling an individual's sense of presence and their attention to environmental cues. Or as the idiom goes, nose in a book, head in the clouds, hence Belle, pictured here from Beauty and the Beast, the Disney film. So at present, and this is not to scale, I want to say that right now, this is a rudimentary Photoshop job, but at present, concerns abound that the overuse of smartphones in particular limits the ability of individuals to make eye contact and develop empathy for others. Now, these contemporary apprehensions about mobile communication and its impact on intimacy and compassion in particular are not limited to lay experts or judgmental townsfolk either, like pictured here in the movie. So, in her most recent book, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age, MIT professor Sherry Turkle implores her readers to repair their relationships by reclaiming conversation from the overpowering grasp of their graspable technologies. Now, I want to say there are, of course, some very real issues to take into account when thinking about the pervasiveness of mobile technologies. So one might be driving while texting. It's a very serious issue for us to think about. Intrusive location-based mobile data collection. Again, very serious issue for us to be thinking about when it comes to the pervasiveness of mobile technologies. All valid stuff. But these popular claims of the mobile media's direct and negative effects on meaningful human connections have not gone unchallenged. A number of scholars here in this room, scholars elsewhere, kind of coming to mind, Nancy Baim, Dana Boyd, Mimi Ito, people have been really chronicling the connection between social meaningfulness and our mobile technologies, have all repeatedly demonstrated that this notion of digital dualism, which I think is a phrase that has popped up in the past few years, which I kind of think of as this dichotomy between devalued technological chatter, and the phrase chatter, on the one hand, and valued human conversation on the other, and all of those things kind of being different axes, that all of this misrepresents the complex social relationships that individuals negotiate through and with new media. Now, with that being said, what has been less subject to scrutiny is how moral panics about mobile technologies and the sort of demise of conversation fundamentally concern issues of ability and disability. That's what I want to talk about here today. So for example, let's take Sherry Turkle's cover image here. She's got two wooden chairs on the cover that are facing one another. And what this is representing here is this idea that in the ideal conversation, people's bodies should be positioned in imagining these invisible chairs. I'm thinking about the the Clint Eastwood, the sort of representative chair at the Republican convention a few years ago, and you kind of imagine the person in it, though the person's not there. She's evoking this here. Imagine what fills these chairs. It's not empty chairs. There's people that are meant to fill this in. But there's an idea here about bodies that are in the negative that are being assumed. And so when I saw these red chairs on her cover, I couldn't help but think of this image that I'd come across in my research. So this is a page of the children's illustrated classic, The Little Golden Book of Words. And the ideal conversationalist that's being constructed, not just through Turkle, and I don't mean to just pick on what she's writing, but that there's this construction of the ideal conversationalist who can sit up in a chair without accommodation from a seat cushion or assistance from another person, whose body parts effortlessly, whose trunk, neck, and head effortlessly align to support eye contact, and that eye contact is something willing and ready and effortlessly done. So in short, the ideal conversationalist is being constructed as being of able body and mind from the get-go. And this privilege isn't just evident in the image, the cover image that Turkle is presenting, but also in how she writes about the seductive qualities of machines with voices, such as Apple's artificially intelligent agent Siri. And so Turkle explains that during our evolution, the only speech we heard was the speech of other humans. Now, with the development of sophisticated artificial speech, we are the first humans asked to distinguish human from non-human speech. Neurologically, we are not set up to do this job. So what Turkle, my interpretation of what she's saying here, she's vaguely alluding to evolutionary biology without the empirical evidence to back said illusions up. But she's creating this tension and this antithetical relationship between mobile communication and authentic communication. And moreover, that embodied oral speech is fundamental to the human experience. But what about people who communicate primarily through said machines with voices, whose bodies do not conform to those red wooden chairs? The most famous of these individuals is, you might recognize, Stephen Hawking, famous scientist, but who's pictured here, but the American Speech Language Hearing Association estimates that at least 2 million Americans have an impairment that limits their ability to talk in the traditional sense. And those who are unable to or have significant difficulty supplement their capacity for speech through tools and strategies that are known in the clinical world of speech-language pathology as augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC, which ironically is a mouthful to say. But individuals with developmental disabilities like autism, acquired disabilities such as those resulting from a stroke, or degenerative disabilities like ALS, use these systems to augment any oral speech that they might be able to use, or as an alternative to it altogether, as in the case of Hawking. So that's where the augmentative and the alternative come from. And those are words that are going to be very important for us today. Because in my talk, what I want to do is make the case that all mobile communication technologies in some way augment or serve as an alternative to embodied oral speech. Be it the sending or receiving of text typed by fingers into the keyboard of a mobile phone, or Hawking's delivery of a presentation typed into a computer that's mounted to the arm of his wheelchair through a sensor that is in his eyeglasses that he manipulates through his cheek. All of these things are being used in order to talk. And they both involve mobile communication that bypass the bodily production of oral speech. So I thus propose situating mobile communication practices along a spectrum of what I'm calling communication augmentations and alternatives. So I'm kind of just flipping that other terminology, because I found in my research that individuals with speech disorders may rely more centrally on an array of mobile media, so more different types and different kinds of push and pulls on the relationship between themselves and different human and non-human resources. But by subverting the normative structures used to classify human dependence on communication technology, I think that we can better account for the disabled experience as an innately human one. So I'll begin by providing a fuller explanation of this, because I think what's fundamental here is understanding how rich and how a lot of the terms in the field of AAC maps on in interesting ways to the field of communication. So where communication sciences and where communication studies overlap in different ways. And then I think that it's important to also unpack within that what that term communication means in AAC. Because I think it's not just about kind of drawing on the work of disability and disability studies into communication, but I think there's some interesting ways in which communication theories can inform the understanding of AAC. I'm then going to ground my conceptualization of communication augmentations and alternatives in two cases from my fieldwork and contrast and compare some of the issues around inequality and equity and the meaningfulness of these technologies in people's lives to flesh that out. And then I'm going to conclude by suggesting just a handful of new approaches to the social study of technology that I think this framing of communication augmentations and alternatives opens up. And I'm very interested in other connections you might see or might disagree with the connections I've made too. That's also something to be open for interpretation. So defining augmentative and alternative communication. And so before going any further, I think it's important to provide you with an audiovisual example of what this sounds and looks like, and also to be able to have young people who use these technologies speak for themselves on the role that these technologies play in their lives. So earlier this year, Apple published this short video to YouTube entitled Dylan's Voice in support of Autism Acceptance Month. And so we're gonna watch it together. And as I tend to do in my classes, I always have like a question to think about before we watch the video. While you're watching the video, you can think about the question, then we can talk about the question afterwards. And so the question that I wanna pose to you all that we can discuss after is, what technology does Dylan use to communicate? So what technology is Dylan using in this video? This is Dylan here. So with that, I'm going to switch out to the video.
My name is Dylan, and I am autistic. All my life I wanted so badly to connect with people. But they couldn't understand, because I had no way to communicate. I get to experience the world in a very unique way. I can see the wind, hear the flowers. I can feel incredible emotions flowing from those I love. Many. So many people can't understand that I have a mind. All they see is a person who is not in control. But now you can hear me. The iPad helps me to see not only my words, but to hold on to my thoughts. Having a voice has changed everything in my life. No more isolation. I can finally speak with the people who love me. I can say what I think and let them know I love them too.
Hello, my name is Dylan Glenwash. We are the reality of our thinking life. And are capable of so much if we just open our minds.
So, oops. So first, initial thoughts about that video. And I would say certainly it is, we can also analyze it in terms of corporate communication and sort of Apple's branding. And in my book, I discuss the ways that people made sense of this particular type of media and its meaning and how they understood their own connection to these technologies, which I'm happy to talk about more, but initial interpretations. Mm-hmm.
Well, first thing, I had no idea how he produced, what he did to produce that speech. So that video doesn't show any of that. So
And when you say how he produced that
how did
speech?
he generate that speech? How did he make those inputs to get those outputs?
So kind of thinking about input and output and how much are we not seeing in what this video presents to us?
And it's not there at all.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? Mm-hmm.
It's framed in such a way to suggest that the iPad is the technology that's helping him communicate, but the iPad itself is a cluster of different technologies that are facilitating this longer process of input and output.
Mm-hmm. So the iPad becomes a placeholder for a couple different technologies, but that's the thing that gets talked about perhaps the most. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in his just physicality and how his body movements are also communication. So I think it's a dinosaur on his hand.
Mm-hmm.
I might say that's a technology. It has some meaning to him, and then you notice it with his gesturing. So that's curious to me. And then also the role with his mom, sitting with him as he's constructing it or as he's on the graduation stage, kind of being there along with him.
Yeah.
And what that.
Yeah. So to clarify, so the woman in the video is his speech therapist.
Okay.
There's another separate video that I didn't show where his mom talks. So his mom, in the graduation speech, she's the one filming. And so you can hear her kind of talking over the video. So that's his speech therapist, and his mother is sort of separate. But you're right in a couple of things. A, that people are a kind of technology, and also the learned techniques, so the therapist's support for how to best facilitate his communication is its own kind of technique that is applied to how he understands language and how he's able to communicate. And then the dinosaur, so a number of people on the spectrum might prefer, in order to write for self-regulation or soothing, a sort of fidget toy, whether that's sort of oral or whether that's with hands, whatever kind of material. And so for Dylan, that is a plastic dinosaur. And that's an object that he is using for him to best be able to communicate his thoughts. So there's a dynamic here between multiple kinds of objects that are digital and non-digital, so a plastic dinosaur and an iPad. Mm-hmm.
So another comment about the video, that all the speech is generated as if it's talking to us or somebody, but it's not a conversation. So how does this work in a conversation with another person, for example?
So, and not just a conversation with another person, but a conversation between somebody who communicates through oral speech and somebody who uses a device. Also, two people who use communication devices communicating with one another.
Sure.
So another kind of interpersonal mediated dynamic that comes through that. We don't see that beyond this video as well. Any other kind of thoughts?
Oh, I was really torn because simultaneously I was really moved. This is so beautiful. This is so wonderful. This young man, but then a little bit of me, I feel bad about this, but I was like, this is an Apple marketing tool, and also like that, kind of infamous case of Rutgers about facilitated communication, and I was like, based on what I could see of how he, when he was producing oral utterances versus the sophistication of what was being produced. And I thought, oh, maybe there's something not legit going on here. And I was a little bit and then I thought, okay, well, I don't know what's going on. But
Right, we don't know enough. But you bring up a good point that gets us into our next sort of section here, is that Dylan is both using oral speech production to a certain extent, and these various tools and these various materials. So it gets us into thinking about, well, what is the sort of array of these technologies that are called, and not just technologies, but what's known as AAC. So the world of AAC is a lot broader than this video. So I kind of mapped this out here. There's two basic types this is from the clinical speech language. I don't know if we have anybody in the audience who's from the field of speech language pathology, but so there's kind of two, and please correct me if I haven't exactly gotten it right, but there's generally two kinds of AAC, what is known as unaided and aided AAC. So unaided AAC systems rely exclusively on one's body to convey a message to another person. So this includes non-spoken language, such as smiling or frowning, non-lexical sounds, so not words, but laughter or groans. Those are still oral utterances, but they're not words. And sign language as well. In the AAC literature, sign language is considered unaided AAC. So somebody might use all of those communication techniques along with these aided technologies. And as you can see here, they vary in their level of technological richness, and for me, when I was first coming to AAC, I think I initially had to kind of get it kind of shaken out of me starting in communication. No, technology is also books, technology is pencils, technology isn't just digital stuff. And coming to this and be like, oh, they already figured that out. Like, that's already part of the AAC world, which to me was like, oh, maybe there's translational work here that can be bridged because we're already starting on a kind of shared level here. So low-tech systems, so we're starting up here, are cheap in cost, simple in design, don't require a power source. That's what makes them low-tech. So examples include pencil and paper. So there were kids in my study who, besides also using the iPad, would have like a pad of paper and write messages down. That was maybe a quicker way sometimes, or when your iPad isn't charged, a pencil and paper will do. So that's another sort of tool to think about. And also people, so the dynamic of other people to facilitate, so that facilitation is a much more complicated word in the FC, facilitated communication, is its own kind of category, but something like this is an E-Tran board. And if anybody saw the movie The Theory of Everything, the Stephen Hawking biopic, this exact kind of board is used as he builds up to using his speech generating device. This happens along the pathway. So this is sort of an eye gaze board where there's a routine developed where one can use their gaze to point out letters and spell words out. And if you are working with somebody who knows your speech really well, so it's like human predictive text, who can guess the words that you're going to speak next because you generally put them in the same order. There's a dynamic there where it's not just about the technology and the people, but there's a running fluidity between how communication is constructed there. So those are low-tech AAC. Mid-tech tends to be battery operated, digitized speech, so speech that's pre-recorded and output, and it's just a couple of messages, so not a lot of memory there. You've got your high-tech systems then that are permit users to select symbols, text from a dynamic screen, so not something that's like a static AAC, the options don't change, versus a dynamic system where you can press a button and new options open up. You press another button, other options open up, and then it can retract back on itself to get you to another word. So those are dynamic systems. And those can use either digitized speech or synthetic speech as well.
Comment?
Yeah.
I think I would object to saying that American Sign Language is a form of AAC. That would be saying like French is an alternative.
So this is in the speech language pathology literature that I've come across is classified sign language as unaided AAC.
That's terrible. It's a terrible way to think of a foreign language or a different language.
So not as a different language, but I guess as in terms of something that isn't oral speech. So we're going to get into this. What is communication?
Okay.
So we're going to get into that, and right. So it's a sense of it all depends on what we're calling communication here, and how communication is being instructed to think about what's an alternative and augmentation to it. So and these are tensions for us to an opportunity for us to have a conversation about it. So can I ask which department are you?
Computer science.
Computer science, okay, yeah. So sort of.
I know sign language.
Yeah, and this is not to, but it's sort of thinking about it as a suite of tools that aren't oral speech.
It's not a tool, it's a language.
So a mode of communication that isn't oral speech. So and certainly it has its own grammar, it has its own culture. There's a lot of that stuff, but there's also people who aren't deaf who use AAC or who use sign language. There's certainly tensions there between the culture of sign language and other individuals who use sign language. Babies who use sign language as a early literacy, like sign language has it travels a lot of places outside of the deaf community. So with that. So let me see, get my stuff back together here. So today's system, so we sort of left off at Hawking here, but these systems now also include software in the general marketplace, like the Apple App Store. When combined with things like tablets, smartphones, and even watches, they mimic these traditional high-tech devices. So this is, for example, this is a promotional image that's put out by the Dutch assistive technology company Assistiveware, which also produced the software that Dylan used in that video. And this is announcing that their AAC app, Colloquium, which is the app that all the kids in the study that I conducted were using, was now available for the Apple Watch in addition to iPads and iPhones. So does anybody notice anything interesting about this image? Yeah.
Presentation of it, it's like, are you talking about the stick figure guy? Or is
Just,
it
and I say image, everything on this slide.
everything on the side?
What was it used before? I guess it says now also for communication.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bingo. That's when I first saw this, so I had sort of a couple of thoughts. So one, what did Assistiveware think that the Apple Watch was for beforehand? And then second, what do they mean by communication? Because clearly we've got some different definitions working here when they say now also for communication, exclamation mark. So that gets us into then this conversation about, well, what do we mean by communication in AAC? And this is where I think comm theory can help explain a bit of this. So as I see it, there's a couple different ways to understand. And I have a book chapter coming out that separately gets into some of this stuff. So to start off, so in the communication sciences literature, there's the clear influence of the transmission or sender-receiver model of communication. So this model, developed at Bell Labs by Shannon and Weaver in the late 1940s through their work in telephony, has really had a far-reaching influence on fields far beyond speech-language pathology. So cybernetics, linguistics, modern communication theory. It's traveled very far, and I understand that Shannon kind of wrote about ways in which, like, I wish it didn't go so far because it means some different things, and I meant, people have ownership over their theories, but theories travel and they get interpreted, and we have to live with that. But it characterizes a successful communication act as one in which a message is transferred from point A to point B through channel C with its singular message intact, sort of the basic model. And in speech-language pathology and in kind of talking with SLP professionals and reading the SLP literature, this model informs how language is quantified, so number of words, length of sentences, frequency, which can then be used to measure, diagnose, and treat breakdowns in communication. So think about breakdowns and how to repair breakdowns in communication. So communication scholars might also think about, well, James Carey might have something to say about this. So in his landmark essay, A Cultural Approach to Communication, Carey points out that this transmission model is limited and that it doesn't take into account how social and cultural dynamics shape the meaning of messages, or what Carey termed a ritual view of communication. And drawing on the work of anthropologist Clifford Geertz, Carey wrote, quote, "Communication is a symbolic process whereby reality is produced, maintained, repaired, and transformed." I feel like I should get that on like a plaque or something and put it somewhere. So from this perspective, then AAC is more than just the transmission of messages. It involves the exchanges of meaning in a given context. So we've seen a couple of contexts here. So a graduation address is a kind of sociocultural context in which we have to understand the meaning of any kind of speech act. The voiceover of a commercial is its own kind of ritualized form of communication. So that gives us another angle here. But in addition to the transmission and ritual views of communication, we've got a third theory for us to draw on. So the domestication perspective, developed by Roger Silverstone and his colleagues in the early 1990s, also underlies the meaning of communication here. So domestication theory posits that media and communication technologies are material objects with a physical presence, and they develop their own kind of biographies as they move over time and people move with them. So how it applies here is that people with communication impairments might develop particular relationships to certain platforms, certain preferences for certain makes and models. And also with Dylan, his fidget toy is also another kind of object that constructs his communication. So we have to think about all of these things together, I think, to understand what that C currently means in AAC. So as with communication then, the terms augmentations and alternatives are equally kind of up for grab for us. So these are not fixed categories, and their distinctions aren't always clear-cut, hence a spectrum, as I'm imagining, between them. Because everyone, including individuals with speech impairments, pulls from a sort of repertoire of methods and a range of tools to fit particular communicative opportunities, which leads to all of us being more or less understood by other people. So any number of factors can constrain a person's ability to communicate solely through spoken language. This might include our abilities at a given point during the day. So in the morning, if we're a little groggy, we haven't had coffee, we might be a little more mumbly or something. Environmental factors. So at a Seahawks, at a viewing party at a bar, having an intimate conversation with somebody next to you or somebody across the bar, when there's other kinds of noise disturbance, that can affect our ability to communicate with another person through oral speech. The individual or group with whom one is communicating. So somebody who might be speaking, who might not speak the same language as you, or who might be a native speaker in a different language as you. Those can create particular communicative opportunities as well as barriers, or just even the social norms around things like turn taking in a conversation. So how that can facilitate the steady flow of being understood. So it's because of this variability that the International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, the ISAAC, emphasizes the universality of augmentative and alternative communication for all people, not just those who sometimes or regularly experience impaired speech. So the ISAAC explains that, so quote, whenever something constrains the effectiveness of our spoken language, we will use an augmentative form. Therefore, the use of AAC is a question of degree rather than difference. And it's that degree part that I want us to think more about. So in my field work, I noticed that this range of degrees and the thinking about the social context and the rituals around communication have to be accounted for in our understandings of what it means to develop empathy and relationships with one another through mobile communication. That to have a more accurate reflection, a more human reflection of mobile communication has to reflect these multi-layered, convergent, and collaborative uses of mobile technologies in everyday life. So I want to draw your attention then to the experience of two boys from my research, Sam and Pargev. These are all pseudonyms, and Donna and Karun. And their stories illustrate how the authenticity of communication, the meaningfulness of conversation, and the intimacy of relationships can't just be reduced to the presence or absence of mobile media or synthetic speech. So first with Sam and Donna. So I first met Donna at a local assistive technology conference where she was a featured parent on an advice panel. So we met over coffee. And her son, Sam, who was 7 years old at the time, is an upper middle class white boy with multiple disabilities, so including autism and spina bifida. And Sam had used Proloquo on the iPad, the original app, for about a year, but then he'd switched to a different technology called the Vantage Lite, which is pictured here, because the software in Proloquo, Donna said, was kind of limited, and Vantage Lite offered him a lot more options as his language developed further. The software was much richer. And in a later interview, she also discussed the role of mobile communication kind of in different ways as it related to Sam's language development. So she told me in our interview how, quote, each and every night, so Sam used his Vantage Lite to speak to his grandmother. She said that Sam, quote, uses FaceTime through the iPhone. We place the phone through the handle of the Vantage Lite so it stands up, and he talks to his grandma and tells her about his day. And so when I asked her, where does grandma live? I'm thinking you're FaceTiming, like maybe grandma lives like in another state or something. And Donna replied, she lives 5 miles away. Because she explained that they converse, and it's all for practice. It's a nightly ritual that we do. So mobile communication here does not so much degrade an empathetic bond between Sam and his grandma. And it's not just one, we can't just think of one technology here in isolation from the other. We have to think about them all together and how they enable Sam's communication in the first place. What's interesting, there was a story then that to me seemed very related, and yet not, in terms of Pargev and Karun. So Karun described how her extended family had actually participated in a similar ritual, but that this exclusively occurred back in her home country of Syria, prior to her husband, and her 2 sons fleeing the ongoing civil war there. And they had resettled in the greater Los Angeles area. And so before their departure, Karun had homeschooled her 13-year-old, minimally speaking, autistic son Pargev, and taught him what she called communication by mobiles. And I asked her what did that term mean? And she explained that she used to have Pargev memorize cell phone numbers that she'd written down for him in a little address book. And she said, quote, we would put mommy's number, daddy's number, grandmother, grandfather's number, all the numbers. And after Pargev had memorized them, Karun wrote each one down on a little scroll of paper. So we're thinking also here about communication as an object, in itself a form of mobile media. So she'd put the scroll, she'd write each individual number on a scroll, and then put the scrolls in a little basket. And each day as part of his lesson, Pargev had to select one of the scrolls and call the number to talk to the person. And so like Donna, Karun enlisted here both her social network and the telecommunications network to support her son's language development and to distribute that education. And so she tasked each family member with asking Pargev questions, she said, just to make him get used to talking on the phone. Questions like, how are you? What did you do today? Did you do math? What was interesting, though, is that whereas Donna currently found it really easy to implement these daily sort of FaceTime chats between Sam and his grandma, Karun spoke of her family's routine strictly in the past sense. She said wistfully of life in Syria, I used to do things like this a lot over there. Now that the family, though, had to live within a much more constraint of economic, social, and cultural resources, Karun said, for my husband, he left his clinic, we left our parents, everything else we left there, including communication by mobiles. So why Sam, Pargev, and their families experienced connection and disconnection has a lot more to do with just technology. Their experiences with augmentative and alternative communication complicate these neat distinctions between face-to-face, mediated, and computer-mediated communication. And the conversation acts that I've just described are distributed across bodies and bodies of water, between objects and practices, and even the tools that they use to talk, from cell phones to address books to paper scrolls, they're all a kind of augmentative and alternative communication tool. Even though neither is fully able to produce oral speech, it's a way of talking and reliably produce it. So Pargev could talk on the phone sometimes, but sometimes not. It was not necessarily a reliable way of communicating for him. And so I think their cases make clear that there are these social, cultural, and political implications at first, just when we think about mobile communication and who we include as part of the population of mobile users, that the status quo here is really obscuring the human experience of individuals with disabilities and the differences among them as well. Because communication by mobiles, to use Karun's word, is human communication. So the sort of lens here, we're thinking about also, we can think about language itself as a kind of technology. So anthropologist Joshua Reno argues that the very idea of language acquisition implies that speech is something owned, a property that we all comfortably possess, rather than a skill that most but not all are equipped for, which requires practice and may involve lifelong struggle. So what it means for Sam and Pargev then to have a conversation can't be understood. We can't separate technology and technique here, but these assumptions about having speech is a thing that we comfortably that we can say, just like they say that we have speech, and in my book I talk about sort of that we give voice. All these things as if they are static and if they never change and if we aren't continually negotiating with what those things mean in relation to our environment, in relation to other people. So then I think then that the lens of communication augmentations and alternatives just offers us a more humane understanding of human connections. It's kind of the point I want to get across here. That all of us, when we pick up a new mobile technology, it's going to take time, it's going to take effort, trial, error, practice to master, anything we pick up. But what makes AAC systems distinct isn't that they're used by people with disabilities or people with temporary or permanent communication impairments, but that they take more time, repeated effort, waves of trial and error, and consistent practice in order to augment or replace embodied oral speech. And we have to think about this all taking place in a predominantly speaking world. So that's a sort of much bigger context for us to understand structurally. That we're in a society that where speech is privileged in terms. So John Durham Peters has written kind of richly about this and the ways in which voice is truth, honesty, very much tied to what Turkle has been talking about. So I think then as well that placing mobile communication and conversation with sort of critical disability studies in particular, with that kind of scholarship, contributes to a larger public dialogue about the tools that give assistance to all human bodies, as opposed to conceiving of some items as specialized within the mainstream, and thus outside of the domain of communication studies. So STS scholars Sarah Hendren and Meryl have each argued in their respective artistic and historical projects that what makes a technology assistive is largely shaped by the context of its use, as opposed to intrinsic qualities of the technology or the technology user. So really what I'm getting here is sort of a corollary to that, that then for us to think about, instead of all technologies as being assistive, all mobile communication technologies as being augmentative and alternative. So this is sort of part of we've gotten to this point now. So in the last couple of minutes here, thinking about, well, now how does this apply perhaps in different ways to some broader questions around communication technology, agency, practice, design, a lot of things for us to potentially use this as a tool. And I also, when I say practice here, I mean practice both in the sort of practice of everyday life, Dessertoian sense, but also clinical practice, and in what ways those shape the everyday lives of individuals with disabilities too. So the first relates to perceptions of stigma in public places. And when I say stigma, I'm referring here to Goffman's notion of stigma as a kind of language of relationships between attributes and stereotypes. And it's a language that we use to shape the social conditions of what it means to belong and participate. So for example, you can take a look at these two objects. People want to say what these objects are, if they know what they are. We got a selfie stick. Was that? A head pointer? Yeah, so a head stick. So this is a picture that I found in a kind of older assistive technology magazine from the 80s. But so a device used to with limited use of one's hands to be able to select keys on a keyboard. They now have capacitive ones, so instead of using your finger to touch a screen, you can use the capacitive stylus with the head stick to touch the touch screen too. And then this is obviously Obama taking a selfie with the selfie stick. So what's interesting, though, is that both of these are accessories to mobile communication technologies. And I have a whole chapter in the book that really points out that we're missing a whole area of talking about mobile communication when we don't talk about accessories. They're not just for fashion. They are functional, but they're also political. So we have to talk about them. And both of these tools also, what's interesting is they extend reach, either towards or away from the technology. But by comparing these two things, visually they're very similar. But in general, what does it mean to use communication technology in a normal way? How do we what are the tools and methods that we use to investigate what normal means in this context? And we're getting there, but these relationships are things that we're just beginning to, I think, approach. Especially when you sort of the pervasiveness of this kind of technology. People have a lot of opinions about selfie sticks, that it disrupts in a certain way what it means to a normal usage, and so that's why I think it's kind of interesting. So second is that we might also think about how augmentative and alternative communication and alternatives to embodied oral speech are imagined as authentic forms of communication, particularly in light of recent developments in pervasive computing and the Internet of Things. So take, for example, the example of Hello Barbie, Mattel's foray into artificially intelligent talking dolls. And there's a lot of concerns that Hello Barbie has raised around data and privacy and cloud computing and all this other kind of stuff. Kids are saying things and there's a cloud that's collecting it. What about the under 13-year-olds? What should we do about that? But one concern has been, well, will kids think that they're having a real conversation with Barbie? And what would that mean? And I'm more interested in, well, what if you already use synthetic speech as a way to communicate? But you have a different relationship to a doll that also talks with synthetic speech. Or if you're the sibling, or you are around people, or perhaps there is, for you, you're frequently around individuals for whom not that they are artificially intelligent beings, but that they are beings who use synthetic speech. So threading apart, at least here, what we mean by authentic communication. And I think that means thinking about this in relative to different kinds of users with different kinds of capabilities, and thinking about what conversation means there. And then lastly, screen-based communication has to be sort of mentioned as a thing that individuals with sensory processing difficulties or on the autism spectrum might have particular relations to that differ from individuals who don't identify as such. And so the moral privileging of looking someone in the eye instead of looking down at a mobile device ignores the needs of those for whom direct eye contact can be overstimulating. So as John Elder Robison in his New York Times bestseller Look Me in the Eye has pointed out, in what ways then, besides just thinking about those who identify perhaps as neurodivergent and thinking more along the lens of neurodiversity, in what ways do all of us have particular sensory needs? And that we use media to self-soothe or to regulate in certain ways. And so orienting ourselves to perhaps a more sensory understanding of our approaches to mobile communication. So these are just a few directions, and I'm interested in other kind of applications of thinking about this augmentation and alternative angle, and the work that you do. So to just sort of reframe, to conclude then, I think that there's a part of communication scholars are generally comfortable with multimodality, with thinking about different forms of mediation. But our basic models of communication still aren't centrally informed by the materialities, imaginaries, and realities of disability. And so new concepts are needed to describe the complex relationships between technology, sociality, and embodiment in contemporary socio-technical systems. And so communication alternatives, augmentations and alternatives as a sort of larger framework is my contribution to this initial kind of project. So to just, to kind of close up that, I think future research, another thing that's really key here is that empirical work on mobile technology, mediated communication, and interpersonal relationships has to move conversation from the abstract to the prosthetic as metaphor in the McLuhan sense, to concretely understanding the role of disability, to really be in conversation with individuals with disabilities themselves. So as autistic blogger Sarah Ludeman explains, people who oppose the use of screens aren't trying to silence disabled people. The problem is that they aren't thinking about us at all. So clearly more critical thought is needed in who we include and who we don't include in mobile communication research. And that's my talk.
So we have time for some Q&A. Monica.
Thank you. Hi, thanks a lot for this fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to ask a question that had to do with kind of the last few slides, which is, it seems to me today that a lot of the technologies that are being designed are really attentive to ideas of universal design, responsiveness, like multi-platform use. And I just wonder, in your research, have you come across, maybe no, much acknowledgement of the fact that the kind of, not necessarily disabled communities, but these ideas were already like really being developed, and these technologies were already being developed by a particular group of quote unquote users. How much acknowledgement of that is there in something like iPad? Why are they doing what they're doing?
So a lot of the sort of rhetoric around like, now all these technologies have all these cool things, that was just particularly salient among the sort of clinicians, the speech pathologists who were, who had to, their jobs partly was dependent on keeping on top of new technologies, new updates. One thing that was really interesting though in seeing families and parents engage with these technologies, with things particularly that were labeled as accessibility, even though things were under, and this is, I'm specifically referring to sort of the Apple operating system here, the things that were put under the accessibility label, the context of it becoming an accessibility tool varied. So one function, and it's probably, if you have an iPhone, you can open it up, is called guided access. And so guided access, what it does is if you have a screen, you can enter a certain passcode and it locks it so that you can't move beyond the app unless you triple press the home button and then enter the code again. Guided access is considered an accessibility feature. So it's also kind of a walled garden though. So it's been phrased, and I was reading some tech article that was like, it's used for kids and kiosks. So kiosks it's used so that you can't move beyond that screen and end up on the home screen for automated labor, replacing a person with a tablet there. And it's also used for kids so they can't get out of using one particular app and bounce around between them. So it's a kind of regulation that's related to other kinds of who's in control here. And it could lead to kids being frustrated. Some kids, though, who learned the codes, the kids that I was observing where parents were like, yeah, we set it up, and then that was a big waste of time because they figured out how to do it. Some ways in which parents got locked out of the kids got locked out of the systems because it was the schools controlling the technology through guided access. So you had a lot of ways in which to say that that's an accessibility, function is highly contextual. And so I think I'm kind of interested in, there's awareness of this stuff. We also need to be reflective of how do we categorize what makes something an accessible function or not.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say something about keyboards? And so many of the images that you had involved traditional keyboards, and even the box that involved glasses, the alphabet, sort of had the alphabet in a traditional grouping of letters. And do people design for other groupings of letters or other kinds of keyboards?
There's lots of different kinds. So QWERTY is, we ended up with QWERTY because there were a lot of different options that we could have ended up with. There's keyboards, there's ergonomic keyboards, there's keyboards that are set up particularly for use with feet instead of hands. So different kinds of inputs that way. So there's lots of kind of alternative inputs to keyboards where you can, so organizing sort of one's ideas. So it doesn't just have to be, so in AAC systems, you can type directly or you can choose symbols and text that are organized in a certain way related to certain relationships between verbs and nouns. So there is a sense though that there is an organizational system. And so that might be sort of a traditional linear alphabet or a QWERTY keyboard. Dylan, I think, spoke about it really well in the video where he was saying, now that I have this technology, I can also see seeing his ideas and being able to visualize and understand what he's saying because he has a workspace to work through those ideas. So I think that the
But you still have to learn recording before you can do
So some of them are QWERTY, some of them are like ABC stuff. So I didn't see, there were some kids who were typing to communicate because Proloquo has a keyboard option besides a grid option of picking symbols. So I didn't observe enough, but I know that in the assistive technology sort of space, there's lots of different, and not just with hands, but something called a sip and puff, where it's like you can breathe in and out, and the inhale or exhale is a way of manipulating things too. So it's a whole, for communication scholars, a lot of stuff that is unexplored.
And
Yeah.
so those inputs are the primary form of diversity in mobile design?
So not just so when you say diversity in mobile design.
Well, the way to get, it sounds like the primary way to redesign for people who have diversity needs is through that input device.
So there's a lot of different design options. So one option that I write about in the book is just the kinds of voices that come out of the technology. So in the main Proloquo app, the majority of voices are white and male in terms of voice options. So we're talking not just about sort of visual, was that? Not Dutch, but there's particular codes that are used to label kinds of difference. So I think both the sort of the design of software, the design of outputs for the software, and the design of what encases the technology. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about, and it's not just about the design of the tools, but who's making the decisions about what options people get.
Yes, I wonder if you could distinguish between the two uses of AAC. One for people like Stephen Hawking, who are perfectly intellectually capable, but they just don't have the ability to, for example, use a keyboard. They have very minimal abilities, but they're perfectly intellectually capable. And the other use for people that are not so intellectually capable, but maybe that young kid was fully intellectually able. I don't know, in which case he could have typed on that AAC. I just didn't know how he got that speech out.
Yeah.
Could you distinguish between those two groups?
So I'm not comfortable making a binary distinction between those two groups, because I will say that competence and the presumption of being competent to communicate on one's own behalf, that there's a lot going on there. So in my study, a lot of it was related to class and parents who could best advocate for their kid being capable of communicating on their own behalf, had more opportunities to have whatever modes of communication they were using. So it might have been through these official channels of AAC that were sanctioned by speech language pathologists, but parents who were very adamant in saying, my kid communicates to me through the music that they play, through the ways that they articulate themselves in that manner. But other parents being able to sort of validate that in institutions, to be able to say, maybe we can work with this and use this to foster other kinds of communication, and other parents who were told they were lying. So the competency part, I think, is very complicated when it comes to, and at the same time, there's these stories about a number of parents and clinicians who were, you know, the idea that now somebody got a tool and now that there's a fountain of words and a novel that's coming out that the kid couldn't use before. And there's stories, once they are real stories by real people and they're telling their stories for the first time and being able to say, here are all the ways in which you ignored me, or the ways in which I was mistreated, or all these other things that with the new tool they're able to express. And at the same time, there's this tension that I saw between parents for whom like they hoped that the technology would do that, and if it wasn't doing it, it either led to a sort of frustration with the technology, never with their child, but like a frustration with themselves for not being able to help them fully. And the Hawking distinction, I actually had one parent who brought up, my kid is not like Stephen Hawking, but he brought it up in a way that wasn't just about his intellectual ability. He was also talking about, Stephen Hawking has a suite of people. So there's a wonderful book called Hawking Incorporated. I think Helene Millet is her name. It's like it's an STS like perspective on like, what is Stephen Hawking? Who is he? How is Stephen Hawking constructed in different ways? And the father was actually kind of talking about this, like he's a team of people in Cambridge. He's privileged in all these different ways, materially, economically, yes, intellectually. Stephen Hawking's, you know, different from all of us in this room, I would say too. But he also brought up these different dimensions of distinction. So I'm kind of, there are like various distinctions, but there's lots of other ones that we have to take into account to, in any given context, kind of say who is or isn't capable.
Thanks for being here. Your talk really touched my heart in a lot of ways, thinking about the way that communication is at the center of us trying to make ourselves understandable to others, and the way that this research really highlights that. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit, in hearing your response to the last two questions, about your experience as a researcher, as, you know, we have racism and classism and sexism that come to the forefront, and now we have ageism and ableism. And what has it been like for you as a researcher trying to navigate your position and the people that you're working with, and even just the very fraught linguistic space of what do we say, disabled or alternately abled, and how have you as a researcher navigated that, that kind of fraught experience?
I've made mistakes, and I've asked a lot of questions when I know that I've made a mistake, and asked people to, and not necessarily asked to overburden people to teach me, but figured out where are people congregating where they are laying out some ground rules. So I did a lot of, I started following a ton of people on Twitter. For me, and part of it was related to people who would, there were some parents that I talked with who had a more activist stance, who would say, oh, I found it really helpful to go to this website called The Thinking Person's Guide to Autism. And I started reading a lot of stuff through there. I started following somebody named Lydia Brown. They run a website called Autistic Hoya, and has broken down a lot of terminology. She also, they, is the pronoun they prefer, they are now a law student at Northeastern. So I've had some conversations with them, but sort of breaking down what are some of these terms, and also that knowing I have used sort of the term people with disability, disabled person flexibly in ways because there's no one way. So there's the British cultural tradition of disability, which is have a more person first model, but then there's certain different disabilities themselves. So so individuals who are deaf, so deaf people, is a different sort of relationship that people have around circular disabilities and what term goes first or second. And so, and that bar none, it's like what people want to be called, to call them that. So I've had some parents who refer to their child as a child with autism, parents who refer to their child as autistic. and I've tried to, in my writing, reflect that, but at the same time know that those children have their own relationship to their own disabilities as well. So also thinking, and it's not, my own background has been in kids and families, and so that's what I bring to this, and I don't mean to infantilize disability as it often is. So, but there's so much work to be done on autistic adults, and that is a community of technology users, as culture makers, and my stuff has kind of been bounded in certain ways, but there's a lot more to be done there. So, and for me, it's, you know, I do not identify as having a disability, and so for me, it's, but I've also thought about disability, and this has been written about a lot before, that the notion of disability as being that we're temporarily able-bodied, that at some point everybody encounters disability, illness, and impairment in their own lives and other people's lives. Of course, at the same time, though, if one has health care, for example, there are ways that you can handle some of those things, or if you live in a place where there's other kinds of infrastructures in place. So that term has also been challenged in some ways as well. But I do think of it as making having research that reflects a more human perspective. And so it's, and just as, like, you know, people talk about when you first get to graduate school, like filling gaps in the research, it's like craters. Like, it's not just about gaps. And so, but again, it's the sort of, I would never say that I would speak for individuals, but there's the social science tools that I can bring and other, like, material resources and other kinds of visibility that I can give to understanding something through the skills, you know, from sociology, from STS, to understand a problem space in ways that individuals who are in it might not be able to, but also have a lot to say in response to these issues as well.
Other questions? Well, with that, let's thank Meryl.